Many claims have been made regarding the Minister of Defense. You can say good things about his 4 years in office, but when it comes to this particular measure, you're saying it was at least somewhat justified, or that it was acceptable.
I can't say I agree with that decision from a professional standpoint.
That's a serious accusation.
It is a serious accusation. And by the way, I'd also add that I don't think there has ever been such a bad minister in the history of the Hungarian Armed Forces or the Ministry of Defense. It's hard to say this now, but I believe that so many requests for discharge have been submitted and there are so many disillusioned soldiers that the Hungarian Armed Forces and National Defense will only exist as long as the state of war threat remains in effect. As soon as that is lifted, they will all be discharged, and our defense capability will approach zero.
The military leadership, or even, well, obviously, the Minister of Defense himself, how wholeheartedly he supported this Chadian mission.
I actually think that as far as the leadership of the Ministry of Defense is concerned, whether it's the minister or the military leadership, the chiefs of staff, that they weren't necessarily happy about Gaspar Orbán now being a captain in the Hungarian Armed Forces, in many respects because he was already moving in circles and at levels where he actually posed a threat to them, and thus to their positions as well. Who knows what Orbán guests might say at Sunday lunch back home?
Sylvester Palinkas, 33, joined the Hungarian Defense Forces in 2017. He served as a rifleman and special operations soldier in Szolnok, then graduated from the highly prestigious British Royal Military Academy, where Gaspar, the Prime Minister's son, also studied. He was later trained as a military intelligence officer in the United States, then joined the staff of the Ministry of Defense as a military specialist, where his direct superior was Defense Minister Krzysztof Szalai Bobrovninsky. He became the face of the Hungarian Armed Forces national recruitment campaign. In addition to appearing in numerous promotional videos, he starred in the series Joint Army, a collaboration between the Ministry of Defense and TV2, where he also assisted with filming as a military expert. Later, he also participated as an actor and expert in the making of the film Dragons Over Kabul, which depicted the 2021 Sharman Shield military rescue operation in Afghanistan. Last summer, we reported on Telex that he had submitted his request for discharge because he disagreed with the leadership of the Ministry of Defense and could not identify with the organization he represented. However, citing the threat of war, they did not allow him to be discharged. After our article was published, the ministry issued a statement saying that Colonel General Gábor Burundi had assigned Palinkas to an operational officer position in Tarta, entrusted him with an important task, and that he could then be discharged by mutual agreement. After his request for discharge, the Dragon's Den production team no longer sought out Palinkas. They did not invite him to the premiere, introduced new military experts to the public, and did not list his name as a military expert in the credits. Below, you can watch our interview with Palinkas, conducted on New Year's Eve, about the situation of the Hungarian Armed Forces. This is a rather unconventional conversation, not a standard interview. Why did you feel it was important to accept our request and speak out publicly?
To put it simply, I believe that in a situation of war, every citizen has the right to an accurate picture of the state of the Hungarian Armed Forces, especially considering that we are, in fact, using taxpayers' money to maintain the country's defense.
We'll definitely discuss this overview, but just to provide some context for the interview, did you have to go through some kind of official or administrative process or request permission to be here now? How does that work in your organization?
Actually, yes. So according to the rules of conduct, the very fact that I was approached to express my opinion in the media should have been reported. I did not do that, just as I did not report that I was here. By doing so, I violated the code of conduct, which will naturally result in some form of disciplinary action.
And what consequences do you think that might have?
I think it depends primarily on the content of the interview. It's hard to say. I think they'll terminate my employment.
By the way, when did you decide to go public?
That's a difficult question. I submitted my resignation in June or July 2025. By then, I had already decided during the officer's oath ceremony that I would leave the armed forces. I didn't know. Over the course of several months, I tried to rebuild what I had lost due to the system, but I didn't succeed. I think that over the past 4 weeks, I've come to the point where I'm ready to say what I want to say.
I'm sure many viewers watching this conversation can connect the dots and realize that recently, several service members have spoken out in public in one way or another. I mean, Police Detective Bence Szabo and Zsolt Laponi from the police. Could your decision to speak out be related to their statements?
Actually, I decided to come here quite a while ago, and I started consciously preparing for it. It really surprised me, though. I consider them absolute heroes. I think that if I could send a message to Captain Bence Szabo, I'd tell him that we won't leave anyone behind. Police and soldiers hand in hand, one heart, one beat.
I'd like to go back in time a bit to the beginning of your career. You joined the Hungarian Armed Forces in 2017, right? Why did you become a soldier?
I was significantly younger back in 2017. Basically, I was looking for a challenge. I was still into esports at the time, but I wanted a physical challenge, and I wanted to explore a new field that I hadn't experienced before. So I enlisted in the Hungarian Armed Forces in 2017 and was assigned to the Special Operations Brigade in Szolnok. After that, I underwent assault rifle training. I completed my training at the NATO Special Operations Center in Belgium.
Back when you decided to join the military, what was it, beyond the physical aspect, that attracted you to this profession? I don't know if you can even call it a profession, or if it's something deeper and more serious than that.
I think it's a calling. Obviously, every soldier might phrase it differently, but the right mindset is to view it as a calling, since in my oath I declare that I will defend it even at the cost of my life. And I took that oath very seriously.
You became the face of the military's recruitment campaign in 2023. On the one hand, how did it feel for you emotionally to be able to represent this organization in this way and to be identified with it in the public eye?
I saw it as a challenge. On the one hand, I was also afraid of it. We hadn't done anything like this before in the Hungarian Armed Forces, so we hadn't singled out a soldier and declared him the face of the military. He represents us both physically and mentally, in spirit, absolutely, as I said. I saw it as a challenge. I tried to live up to that military ethos, which is, or I would say, a moral compass that resides in every soldier's heart. I wanted to live up to that, to live up to the image we project to civilian society and to the image we project to soldiers. And I didn't want there to be a huge difference between the two.
What was the process like when they approached you to be the face of the armed forces?
I was working in Szolnok, just a completely ordinary day. You could say I was on duty. And the phone rang in the office. The minister's press secretary called and asked me to come in the next day to see Krzysztof Szalai Bobromniki, the Minister of Defense. I didn't know what it was about. In fact, my immediate superiors didn't know why I had to go there either. The next day I went up. First I was received by the Hamid General Staff, and then I went in to see the minister. The military leadership at the time made it quite clear to me that if the minister asked me for anything and I said no, my military career could be over. So that's how I went in to see the minister.
What exactly did this warning look like?
They phrased it almost exactly as I just described. They basically added that you can't continue your studies abroad. You can't go abroad. In fact, from now on, you'll spend the rest of your career in a specific position. That's pretty much how it went. The minister laid out his plan for what he wanted to achieve during his term, in terms of numbers, how many soldiers he wanted serving in the Hungarian Armed Forces. To do this, he needs a high-profile recruitment campaign, and he asked me to be the face of this recruitment campaign, or of the Hungarian Armed Forces, during this period.
It's actually quite fascinating to hear this. that it might even seem like such a good thing or an honor from someone's perspective. And yet, why do we have to resort to such methods, immediately putting psychological pressure on someone I'm actually trying to invite to work with me?
I think there's a bad habit in the military that I hope won't exist in the future. And that is that we always report up the chain that everything is fine. And we try to convey to the decision maker that, so to speak, I, as the commander, and the personnel working under me, they all think the same thing. Everything is fine here, Minister. The soldier you have selected does what you want. And I think every senior leader tries to convey this image to the minister, whether it reflects reality or not.
It didn't take long from there, did it? You became the face of the recruitment campaign in 2023, and then in 2025, you submitted your request for discharge. At the time, you explained this to Telex by saying that you didn't agree with the Ministry of Defense's management philosophy and couldn't identify with the organization whose face you had become. What did that mean specifically?
The fact that I submitted my request for discharge and, how should I put it, the erosion of my commitment to the officer's creed is a long process. I believe it was greatly influenced by, how should I put this? The minister's decisions and systemic changes led me to submit my discharge request because on the one hand, I had to convey an image of the Hungarian armed forces that was absolutely untrue, that everything is fine here. It's always great here. Come and enlist as a soldier. Actually, it's about the future in your career. And meanwhile, I saw how much my fellow soldiers, with whom I had served before this assignment, were suffering and submitting their discharge requests one after another. And I felt this kind of contradiction within myself, that my best comrades actually want to get out. In fact, they're already resentful of me because of this, because I'm conveying that everything is fine. Yet their fate as soldiers is getting worse day by day.
That's very interesting, because so you specifically felt a personal responsibility for the fact that the public isn't seeing that image, and people are being recruited into the army under the impression that things are a certain way, only to find out later that it's not actually happening the way you show in the photos, for example.
Absolutely. I think the recruitment campaign can actually be broken down into different phases. It was very clear that the minister was being asked for a specific number. I think the Prime Minister asked for nothing else, a specific number on the table. This is how many soldiers I want. And in fact, the recruitment campaign served this purpose. At the beginning of the recruitment campaign, we produced social media content for various social media platforms. These were military messages conveyed in the form of short videos to spark interest, to showcase our army, and to highlight how much we've developed in recent years. The problem was that, in my opinion, the press office of the Prime Minister's office didn't have enough military knowledge to avoid making fools of ourselves. And I often felt that, due to professional shortcomings in these videos, what is otherwise the most noble profession becomes a subject of ridicule, both among soldiers and among civilians. If we compare our recruitment campaign, even just looking at the U.S. Army, to name a close example, to a properly executed U.S. Army recruitment campaign, there's a huge difference.
And to what extent could these professional concerns and criticisms actually be raised internally, addressed and steered in a constructive direction?
I think there were times when I managed to assert my will and bring professionalism to the table, and times when I didn't. And it's actually very difficult to work with social media professionals for whom success is measured by viewership and is reflected in viewership. It's really hard to explain to them that it's not the reach that matters, but the message being conveyed. And that was actually a major problem.
Well, this request for discharge was rejected, and then the Ministry of Defense responded to Telex following the publication of its article last August by stating that Sylvester Palinkas, who had recently been promoted to captain, is a respected soldier of the armed forces for whom the army had paid for the highest level of training and valuable studies abroad. For this very reason, and with particular regard to the threat of war, Colonel Gaspar Orbán, Chief of Staff of the Hungarian Armed Forces, assigned Captain Palinkas to the position of operations officer in Tata and entrusted him with an important task, upon completion of which he may be discharged from the armed forces by mutual agreement. Let's start by asking if you can tell us what this important task is that you were entrusted with.
I'm still trying to figure out what this important task might be. Maybe the commander is still thinking it over, or perhaps the assignment hasn't reached me yet. In any case, I haven't received any specific instructions. This was, in fact, just a message intended for the press or the media.
So you didn't receive any specific special instructions?
I wasn't assigned any special duties, just a completely standard position. By the way, anyone who knows a little about the military can see from my introductory video, or from my military background, that I'm actually a scout and was assigned to an operational role in an armored brigade. So this field has nothing to do with me. This is actually a form of exile. It's a kind of punishment. They actually wouldn't let me go back to Szolnok. So they wouldn't let me go back to Szolnok, which is where I'm actually trained and, so to speak, my home unit, where from a professional standpoint and in terms of national defense, the Hungarian armed forces would have benefited most from me in that position. And instead, they were able to waste my skills in a completely different role that I don't even understand.
By the way, were you given any information regarding the duration of this special assignment, since you didn't know exactly what it entailed? But when would the moment come when you could be discharged?
No, I didn't really receive any. If we're looking at it from that angle, then no. But in reality, I was part of the minister's cabinet staff. My immediate supervisor was Ms. Bata Margatai, the chief of staff. I submitted my resignation to her as my immediate supervisor. Naturally, she forwarded it to the minister. Well, my first reaction was, I submitted it on Friday afternoon, and I actually received an email in response. I won't go into the details of the email now, but the very next day I didn't have to go into work. It wasn't until the day after that they told me to go in, so I went to see the chief of staff. Her first reaction was that I was a traitor.
Is that your superior or what?
Yes, that's the chief of staff. He told me I'm a traitor and asked what I think I'm doing. The defense minister can't let the military lose face before the elections, so I'm being placed on reserve duty. They're handing me over to Colonel Gaspar Orbán to teach me discipline and humility. And by the way, I'd better not dare say that I wasn't granted a military career because I walked beside the minister. That's exactly what was said. Which is interesting because if that's what politicians have in mind, that a military career means you can walk beside a minister, then I think that sends a clear message to every soldier about how the system treats them.
By the way, when you heard that sentence, what did you think?
I did the right thing by submitting my request for discharge. That's what I thought.
You know, within the organization, when they sideline you, and you can't work in the area where you could actually provide the best service, is there any way to let them know, like, hey, this isn't where I belong in Szolnok, for example?
Well, let me just go back to the chief of staff for a moment. So after my resignation, I also spoke with the minister, Krzysztof Szalai Bobramnecki, the Minister of Defense, who viewed my request for discharge as a kind of political maneuver, which is interesting to me because I'm just an average captain. I cannot take a political stance. Then I was told that I am Péter Magyar and Sandy Romulus Roslin, and that I had made a poor strategic decision by choosing a side. In fact, they didn't let me return because even within the Hungarian armed forces, there are those who are assumed to be loyal to, say, Sandy Romulus Roslin. I think this is absolute nonsense, that soldiers don't engage in politics at all and don't take sides. I believe that while on active duty, what their opinions are in their private lives, or which side they choose, is an entirely private matter. So, to suggest that Solnock and the Special Operations Brigade are a Tisa Island or a Sandy Romulus Island, I find that extremely offensive.
What makes Solnock special exactly?
Not because it's in the name, that's for sure. Solnock is considered special because, if you like, it's the spearhead, the place where the best equipped and best trained soldiers are supposed to be. That said, within the Hungarian military, yes, the Special Operations Brigade is better equipped than most other units. But by NATO standards, I think we're near the back of the pack. The ministry loves using images of special operations soldiers and assault troops because they look extremely appealing. As soldiers would say, they look sexy. But in reality, many of those soldiers buy their own gear, and I think that's deeply discouraging. If you want to reach a certain professional level, you have to invest your own money in your equipment. My own kit is worth well over 1.5 million forints, from the helmet to the vest. And even the optics mounted on my weapon are mine, because above a certain level, I simply couldn't do my job properly with the equipment and systems the Hungarian military provides. Even this uniform I'm wearing is my own.
Since the political angle has already come up, and the minister also raised it with you, how was Rusin Sendi Romulus's political role perceived inside the military?
I think Rusin Sendi Romulus threw the defense minister off balance completely. He developed a kind of tunnel vision. He saw Rusin Sendi's followers everywhere, and he wanted to purge them everywhere. He tried to pin every possible rule violation on them, even going back 5 years if he could. That raises serious questions. I believe there's also a kind of professional jealousy on his part. Before becoming defense minister, he had no relevant professional background and no military experience whatsoever. And I'd point to the United States here, because I studied there for almost a year. Look at the kind of defense secretary they choose there. Someone with military experience, someone who has served on 4 or 5 missions in Iraq or Afghanistan. That tells you this is not the kind of post where you can just seat someone with no military experience and no real understanding of the armed forces. Even if you surround yourself with good military advisors, it doesn't help if you don't even understand the question you are supposed to make a decision about. I think that is a fundamental issue.
Can you give an example, a concrete memory, of how this showed itself? You said he was always looking for Rusin Sendi's people. How did that come out in practice?
I remember that when I submitted my discharge request, he asked me what I thought the difference was between a defense minister who had previously been chief of the general staff and one who had previously been a businessman. I answered very simply, the one with military experience will understand the organization and know how to lead it. That is the clear advantage. I see no advantage at all in having a businessman with business connections sitting in the defense minister's chair. There's no real basis for it.
And what did he say to that?
He accepted it. He nodded, and then we said goodbye. I didn't follow every single element of the character assassination campaign against Rusin Sendi Romulus that we saw in the media. But one thing is certain. The majority of soldiers do not share that view. We knew him as chief of the general staff.
So they didn't agree with what pro-government media were saying about him?
Absolutely not. And in the end, he was able to defend himself because none of the accusations against him were actually proven.
You said Solnock was referred to as a Tisa island, and that they were supposedly looking for people loyal to Tisa. So I have to ask, do you have any ties to Tisa, emotionally, politically, or in any more concrete way?
No, none, and I stand by the principle that soldiers should not engage in politics. And I also stand by the principle that a minister should not drag politics into the life of the armed forces or judge soldiers based on their political views. I think that is extremely important.
You worked directly under Krzysztof Szalai-Bobrovnitsky in the Ministry of Defense. You've already told us how that happened and how you ended up there, but what do you remember about actually working with him? How much of it was really working together?
I worked as a military advisor, so I was sitting at the table where the most important decisions were being made. And I think the simplest way to judge whether he was fit for the role is to look at him as the #1 person responsible for the defense of the country. To assess that, you have to look at the last 4 years. So if you'll allow me, I'd go back to 2023, January 17, 2023. That was when the so-called rejuvenation process took place, when the defense minister invited unit commanders and the senior military leadership to an annual evaluation event held in the Balna building. What made it strange was that the personnel were not told why they were going there. What happened was this. The defense minister opened the year, then handed Rusin Sendi Romulus an envelope and tasked him with announcing the names of the people who were about to be fired from the Hungarian military. That's important because after that, the defense minister left the event and left the dirty work to Rusin Sendi. And that makes me ask, is that what a responsible defense minister looks like? Taking responsibility for the good decisions, but finding a scapegoat for the bad ones? For a young officer like me, and for many of my fellow young officers as well, that simply does not fit with the officer's creed. We are taught that we take responsibility for our people. Every action we take, whether good or bad, is our responsibility. And I also think that the so-called rejuvenation was in part just a message to the civilian public. What people need to understand is that there has been a state of emergency since 2019. That means soldiers cannot resign and cannot really leave military service. They cannot detach themselves from the Hungarian military. On top of that, there is no service pension. Unlike in other NATO countries, there is no such thing as retiring after 20 or 25 years of service. Here, you work until the age of 65. So the positions above are clogged up. Something had to be done about that, and that became Government Decree 823, which essentially made it possible to throw people out onto the street without justification. That mattered because when positions are clogged upward, the old way of dealing with it was this. If a leader was unsuitable for a role, we either created another position of equal rank and pay and moved him out of that responsible post, or we promoted him upward. One way or another, we could remove people from key roles. What the defense minister did under the label of rejuvenation was get rid of people in the key senior leadership positions. In my view, they were the last generation of colonels and generals who still had independent opinions, independent judgment, and who did not simply nod yes to every order coming from above. After that rejuvenation process, a new leadership selection model appeared. And what that meant was that in senior military positions, professional competence was no longer the main criterion. Simplified, loyalty became the main criterion. So the 2023 rejuvenation process was really about preparing the ground for the minister's later plans. No commander would stand in his way because everyone in the right seats would be loyal to him.
You said that to judge his competence, we have to look at what he did over the last 4 years. You've mentioned one example already, the rejuvenation process, and what you think its real purpose was. What else should we look at to evaluate the broader picture?
I think we have to move forward in time and look at the systemic problems and decisions that created these shortcomings inside the Hungarian military. Because by 2026, we have reached a point where the moral low point inside the Hungarian military is deeper than ever before. And there have never been this many discharge requests either. How did we get here? In 2024, a new government regulation on the legal status of soldiers was introduced. In practice, that meant overtime pay was abolished. That was a huge problem. There are many fields in the military where people work weekends as well, and where the amount of service time made it impossible to solve things any other way. The military used to compensate them for this through overtime pay. In some cases, abolishing overtime meant a monthly loss of 150,000 to 200,000 forints for certain soldiers. I'm talking about MPS, ceremonial units, operators of large military vehicles, and others. So yes, this was a serious issue. And then there was the abolition of allowances. Many military allowances were built on top of our base salary, and those were also removed. The one I would highlight as the most painful was the field training allowance, though every specialty had its own allowance. For example, if a soldier went out for 2 weeks to Taberfalva to freeze and get soaked in the bushes, he used to get about 10,000 forints gross per day. That's gone too. So this regulation only took things away from soldiers. It added nothing.
And how did soldiers react to that? How did you react?
Very badly. Of course, I was working in the cabinet, not out there in the field with the operational units, but my heart sank every time I heard what conditions were actually like inside the army. While I was standing in front of the camera, pretending everything was fine and telling people to enlist.
Were you able to raise those concerns with the minister?
I believe the information reached him through the proper channels.
What does that mean?
It means the information did reach the minister, but not in the form it should have, and not at the level it should have.
Maybe the chief of the general staff didn't necessarily communicate the urgency and the full reality of the situation.
Exactly. That's very important. So it's possible he never received a real picture of just how deep this moral low point actually was.
Still, it seems reasonable to think that if you take away compensation of that size from people, they're obviously not going to be happy. I would assume the minister is an intelligent man. He should be able to reach that conclusion himself.
Even beyond that, they also cut leave. The number of annual service-free days was reduced. And another major thing was the introduction of pay bans. Maybe in the private sector, that can increase profit because people can take home more money based on measurable performance. But there is nothing like this anywhere else in the world in the military. Only here. What it means is this. If I'm serving in a given post, there's a lower salary limit and an upper salary limit, and my commanding officer decides where I fall within that range. But by what criteria do you measure a logistician, a reconnaissance soldier, an artilleryman? This is not a uniform system at all. It also gives far too much power to unit commanders, because then the soldier doesn't feel that his salary comes from the Ministry of Defense. He feels it comes from his commander. And that creates the danger of little kingdoms forming inside the military. From a leadership standpoint, I think that's extremely harmful.
You also mentioned the number of discharge requests. Can that be quantified? You said there have never been this many before.
This is hard to say out loud, but I believe there are so many discharge requests and so many disillusioned soldiers that the Hungarian military and the country's defense only really exists as long as the wartime state of emergency remains in place. The moment that is lifted, they will leave, and our defense capability will move very close to zero.
What does that mean in numbers?
I don't want to give specific figures.
But it's a significant number?
Yes, a very significant number. And it won't be the soldiers working in offices who leave. It won't mainly be support personnel. It will be the combat soldiers.
So I assume that if you see it this clearly, then the military leadership must also be aware that once the emergency ends, the number of resignations could become a very serious problem.
When I talk about the military leadership here, I mean Chief of the General Staff, Gaspar Orbán. I think there are two kinds of chiefs of the General Staff. The first kind tries to shield the armed forces from political intent coming from above when that intent harms the military or harms soldiers' lives. He tries to deflect it, redirect it, or change it in order to protect the armed forces. But in doing so, he risks his own position. The second kind bends completely toward the political leadership and carries out everything that comes from above, no matter how destructive it may be to the structure of the Hungarian military. But in return, he keeps his chair. Those are the two types, and then everyone can decide for themselves which type Gábor Burundi belongs to, and which type the previous chiefs who were removed, Rusin Sendi Romulus or General Korom, belong to.
Before the elections, the government paid out the so-called weapons bonus to members of the armed services. From what you saw inside the military, how was that measure viewed?
It did not have anything like the positive effect the earlier one had 4 years ago. As I said, because of the new legal framework, so much had already been taken away from soldiers. So in reality, they were only getting back part of what had been taken from them. It wasn't extra money, and because of that, I don't think it had any positive effect at all on morale.
Was there also an interpretation inside the military that this reflected a political intention, that they were effectively trying to buy soldiers' votes?
Absolutely. Soldiers are not stupid. They know exactly what the purpose was. But if the goal was to change the image soldiers have of the current defense minister, the weapons bonus was far too little and far too late.
And what is that image exactly?
What soldiers really think of the defense minister is simple. He doesn't understand the job, and they are hoping for change.
Lapony Zsolt recently told Telex that he thinks about 90% of police officers will not support Fidesz in the election. Without getting too deep into numbers, how would you describe the military's view of the current government?
I think that 90% is realistic inside the Hungarian military too.
How political are soldiers with each other?
As the election gets closer, more and more. That said, I wouldn't call it political debate because officially they cannot engage in politics during service hours. Of course, people still share opinions with each other at work, but I think the majority are on the same page. So there isn't really political debate. People are simply waiting for the election.
Isn't there fear, though, that if people say this and it gets back to their commanders or superiors, especially in the atmosphere after the rise of the Tisza party, when, as you said, the ministry was looking for Rusin Zendi's people everywhere, they might be less willing to admit it even in private conversations?
I don't think so. It is true that the current chief of the general staff tries to control the limits of free expression inside military circles through the unit commanders. But I think many soldiers have had enough to the point where they would openly say it, especially since most of them want to leave anyway.
Before we go back to the state of emergency in more detail, a lot of claims have been made here about the defense minister. Can you say anything positive at all about his 4 years in office? Anything where you'd say, at least that decision was more or less okay?
I cannot name a single decision that was professionally sound from a military point of view.
That's a very serious statement.
It is a very serious statement. And I would add this, I do not believe there has ever been a worse minister in the history of the Hungarian military or the Ministry of Defense. And I stand by that. Anyone watching this video who wants to test whether my words are credible should ask a soldier. Nowadays, almost everyone has a soldier somewhere in their circle, a family member, a relative, a distant friend. Ask that soldier whether what I've said here is true, and my words will immediately gain credibility.
So you're very confident that the way you see and feel this is very much the majority position?
Absolutely.
Hungary has been under a wartime state of emergency for almost 4 years now. In practical, everyday terms, what extra burden does that put on soldiers?
In practical terms, it means task-oriented command, which means there are no working hours. A soldier goes home when the task is finished. And let's be honest, that means a completely unpredictable life. Soldiers also want families. They want children. They want to be home while their children grow up. But under these conditions, life is completely unplannable. Inside the family, I don't think a soldier can really be relied on in the way that a father or mother normally can be. And to some extent, I agree with that, because they chose this service, they chose this calling, and in the interest of defending the homeland, they must always be ready. The question is, what do they get in return? If we look at different places across the country, or not even just in the countryside, we should look at how much lower-ranking soldiers are paid for this. Let me give one example. An enlisted soldier may earn 300,000 forints net, and that includes the fact that my life is unpredictable. I cannot be at home with my family, and at least twice a month I spend a week on a training ground, getting soaked and freezing. As for food, on the training ground, I get a white plastic bag with 1 kilogram of white bread and 2 cans. In that respect, too, we are somehow unique within NATO. I cannot put together or receive a proper field ration pack that would meet even basic tactical requirements in the field, which means I stuff that bagged bread into my backpack, something the enemy could probably hear from 100 meters away at night, or I pull out some random granola bar. These are basic combat requirements that could literally help protect my life. But I do not even have to go that far. Soldiers would already be happy if they got a uniform that does not tear. Something tear-resistant, flame-resistant, something that protects their life and is of real tactical quality. We do not even have that. Sometimes we sit down in it in the office and it tears.
I know I keep coming back to this, but hearing all this, it sounds so extreme in the case of soldiers that I'm just trying to understand how such basic problems can exist and still not reach the ministry. Why doesn't anyone say, fine, maybe we took a lot of money away from them, but at least let their equipment and supplies be in order?
I think that when military development and reform were planned at a strategic level, we started building from the top instead of from the foundations. The minister's approach was basically, I'll give you a military identity. You are the Hoosiers. He seems to have this fixation on picking some period from Hungarian history and then declaring that this is who we are from now on, renaming units accordingly. In other words, he tried to give us an external image instead of fixing the problems buried in the roots of the system and building a proper foundation first. I won't even go into detail now about equipment, uniforms, or infrastructure. We didn't modernize or renovate barracks. The posters were useful only until they got young people to the gates of the barracks. After that, we couldn't keep them, because from that point on, they saw reality. The recruitment campaign showed the most modern weapons, vests, helmets, and conditions. But that is not reality. Inside, the corridors smell like sewage. The showers are moldy. The accommodations are moldy. Young recruits see that, turn around, and would rather go work stocking shelves for a retail chain where they make twice as much money, can see their family, live a predictable life, and work in clean conditions.
Was this a mass phenomenon, that people signed up because of the recruitment campaign, and then after a few weeks or a few months they quit or terminated their service?
Absolutely. You have to understand that there is a 3-month probation period, and during that period a soldier can still leave. He can say, "Thank you very much, I don't want this." But once that 3-month probation period is over, the state of emergency rules apply to him as well, and he cannot leave the military as long as the emergency remains in force. That was already a problem at the beginning because people kept leaving. And then came that highly visible campaign. people to the iron, where recruitment was built around a fixed and very high salary. No one had ever created this much wage tension before. We recruited 18 to 25-year-olds at 737,000 forints gross, and in many cases tax-free. After 5 weeks of basic training, they were placed into positions where they earned roughly twice as much as a soldier who had been doing the same job for 20 years.
How was that viewed among soldiers?
It created enormous resentment and enormous wage tension among soldiers. No one had ever done anything like this before. Imagine it in civilian life. You hire an intern, and after 5 weeks, he is making 2.5 times more than a middle manager who has worked there for 20 years. That middle manager would be fully justified in saying, "Thank you very much, I'm leaving this company." But in the military, he cannot do that because of the state of emergency. He just has to swallow it.
And when people from such different backgrounds and with such different pay had to work together or serve in the same barracks, were they separated or did they mix?
During training, they were definitely kept separate. Obviously, it was a difficult task for unit commanders to manage that wage tension inside the ranks. But I think soldiers primarily did not blame the newcomers who got that money. Naturally, they blamed the defense minister because it was his decision.
I wanted to go back to the extension of working hours. What does that actually look like in practice? The day starts, no one tells you when it ends, and then in the afternoon, you're told you have to stay until 8 at night? Or is this more about field exercises? How exactly does it work?
Yes, it's entirely possible that we get a task in the morning, finish it by 3 in the afternoon, and then at 3 another task comes in that has to be done until 8 or 10 at night, and then you carry it out because it is an order.
But what kind of tasks can these be?
For example, could it be that at 3 in the afternoon, an order comes in saying that at 5, on the Prime Minister's instruction, you'll be guarding critical infrastructure, so you won't be going home that day, and instead you'll be deployed around, say, a nuclear facility.
And how was that viewed among soldiers? That specific measure?
It's hard to judge, but I think soldiers have a lot of questions in their heads. If we are supposed to defend critical energy infrastructure, the first question is, against whom? Who is the enemy? Soldiers are deployed on the basis of an enemy image. Fine, but then what is that enemy image? Are the Russians coming? Are the Ukrainians coming? Who exactly? Because if there is an enemy image, then we prepare accordingly. We study how that nation fights and what equipment it uses. Soldiers do not know what the supposed enemy image is. And if the government says, soldiers defend critical energy infrastructure against the Ukrainians, that is also strange for us. Why would Ukraine decide to attack a NATO member state and effectively risk its own destruction?
So if I understand you correctly, you don't really see any realistic chance of us getting into a military conflict with Ukraine?
No, I do not think Ukraine would pick a fight with NATO while it is trying to secure both NATO membership and EU membership. Why would it attack a NATO member state?
But inside the military, are there any scenarios or readiness plans for a case in which Ukraine attacks Hungary?
Obviously, every country has different defense plans for different scenarios. I cannot go into details about those. Every nation has action plans for what happens if A occurs or if B occurs. Overall, though, I think that if we take Ukraine as an example, there's a lot going on in the media regarding this. The government is putting out a lot of messages, and various viewpoints are evident. And now, going back to critical infrastructure, how did we end up with our soldiers there? The Druzhba oil pipeline was damaged, which, by the way, was attacked by the Russians. There was a satellite image of this, which was actually taken by the chief technician and his team. This is a BDA, a battle damage assessment. In fact, this is a method of analysis. It's part of the process. In reality, this wasn't a technical assessment. So if a missile strike hits such an oil pipeline complex and the pipeline runs underground, it's not possible to state with 100% military certainty based on satellite imagery. So, in military terms, it cannot be reported to a prime minister that it was not damaged. We do not know if it was cracked. And besides, a complex like this has an electrical grid and a control center. Many of its components could be damaged, rendering it inoperable. The fact that they don't specify where this satellite image comes from is another interesting point. We don't have a satellite, and this wasn't a NATO satellite. I can confirm that.
The fact that there's this vibe in the air, say in political discourse, where Hungary is portrayed as such an adversary to Ukraine, does this come up as a serious topic in conversations among soldiers? Or do you joke about the possibility of getting into a war with the Ukrainians just to see how we'd handle it?
The government's rhetoric regarding Ukraine has become an absolute joke, so we're already making light of it at work. So this kind of image of Ukraine as an enemy, which in my opinion, the government is trying to instill in the public consciousness and communicate to every citizen, simply cannot be taken seriously. And if we look at what the actual military rationale was for weaning ourselves off Russian oil and gas, we can see that if there is a war, we can sustain it only as long as our military logistics function. And military logistics, of course, require money, a source of funding. So in order to wage a war, and very smart military strategies have always focused on this. The goal is to cut off the enemy's military logistics and financial resources. And in fact, that was the goal of the EU sanctions, to cut off the financial resources so that Russia cannot sustain this kind of war in the long term. Now, if we look at the fact that, I believe it was Foreign Minister Saro who said, our purchases actually account for 0.2% of Russia's GDP. I know its annual GDP is something like $6.7 trillion. I don't know the exact figure, but you can buy a lot of tanks with that 0.2%. So I can't give you an exact number right now, but in reality, even if not directly, we are indirectly contributing to their ability to use our money to purchase various tanks and aircraft and sustain this war.
Basically, ever since the Russian-Ukrainian war broke out right next door, the government has been communicating using this kind of constant imagery of war. And as a soldier, I don't know how you experience the fact that there's this constant, immediate threat of war being portrayed in the Hungarian public discourse. How much do you think this correlates with reality?
What really troubles me is that this government has taken sides and is portraying Ukraine as the enemy. In reality, Ukraine is the victim in this military conflict because Russia attacked it. This is common knowledge. What causes me difficulty and raises questions is why. Because of this stance, are we weakening our role within NATO? And why are our relationships of trust weakening?
That's the point.
I have participated in several NATO exercises since the outbreak of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, where soldiers from other NATO member states specifically asked us Hungarian soldiers, are you actually on the Russian side because that's how it seems in your communications? So just tell us already, because we want to know.
And how does that sound?
That's bad. Absolutely terrible. So it was really hard to hear that, because I honestly don't understand why we don't want to be more closely aligned with, so to speak, the world's strongest military alliance. And why can't we come to the same conclusion? I don't see the real reason behind this.
And beyond that, do you think there are any concrete consequences and obviously things that can be said in a public interview like this, such as a loss of trust, or any repercussions resulting from, say, the fact that there's a certain image of Hungarian soldiers in the minds of NATO allies?
Absolutely, absolutely. I was out there in a reconnaissance role. After the outbreak of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, we weren't allowed to attend several meetings where the Ukraine-Russia conflict was specifically discussed. In terms of reconnaissance, the Americans didn't let us attend that NATO meeting.
But these things, let's say, are made public afterward. That there was a NATO meeting here. Just how feasible is it, say, to look these up from past years? Or are these confidential pieces of information that it's pointless to search for, say, on the NATO website?
Absolutely. So these cannot be found. Obviously, on our way home, we reported that we simply couldn't get on board with this. We have no information, and they don't trust us.
It's always said in the domestic media that, on the one hand, there are these accusations and claims that we aren't good NATO allies. But then when someone speaks out at the highest political level, even the Minister of Defense, they always say that we are, in fact, absolutely stable members of NATO, and there's no question that we don't want to be part of this alliance, and that in such cases, speaking as a newspaper reader or a Hungarian citizen, I'm somewhat relieved to hear such a statement, thinking, okay, there are things happening at the communication level, but in reality, this doesn't have any negative consequences for Hungary. But then, if I understand what you're saying correctly, that's exactly the point. There are.
So what I'm actually talking about isn't NATO leadership. The unit where I served, so to speak, was definitely within a NATO unit. Obviously, it wasn't NATO leadership. That said, I think that within NATO leadership, when it comes to such politically sensitive issues and statements, they're careful to avoid causing a major political scandal or perhaps conflict between nations. But in reality, at my operational level, when interacting with personnel from other nations, this issue definitely came up.
And in situations like this, have you, for example, brought this to the attention of your superiors, pointing out that there's a problem here and that it might be a good idea to come up with a solution?
Of course, but actually, I think it was every soldier's duty to always prepare a report on what we observed regarding other nations and what our assessment of them was. I believe various reports are constantly being sent to the leadership.
So they must know exactly then.
Exactly. They know exactly. It doesn't seem like we're trying to do anything with this or improve our reputation within NATO.
As mentioned in the introduction regarding your professional background, you graduated from the British Royal Military Academy, considered perhaps the best military academy in the world. That is, you completed your training there, where, incidentally, Winston Churchill, Will Moss, and Prince Harry also studied. Is this academy really as good as its reputation suggests? Or is there some element of, shall we say, a propagandistic image being presented to the public?
I don't consider it propaganda at all. I believe that in 2019, when I started at the Academy, I received military expertise from the Academy that was absolutely on par with its prestige, world-class military knowledge. Completing the program was an extremely demanding challenge, both mentally and physically. But I'd like to add that, in fact, before I was sent here in 2019, there was a long selection process. So there were actually a lot of applicants for this, many candidates, and it involved a long mental and physical assessment, which is how I ended up at this academy in 2019.
You mentioned that the training here is tough, both mentally and physically. Could you illustrate that a bit so that we as viewers and listeners can imagine what tough actually means in practice?
Actually, in the first phase, roughly the first 5 weeks, there was this kind of intense military socialization, a boot camp. I could talk a lot about that, by the way. I think the first and most important difficulty of boot camp was actually this constant sleep deprivation. During the first week, we slept an average of 2 to 3 hours a day, and this went on for 5 weeks.
And besides that, how much of it was, say, the training part?
All day, all day. So we actually ran everywhere, stood at attention for hours. Actually, the main point here was that we shouldn't feel comfortable. Do we really want this training? Do we really want to be soldiers? The British officer cadets who had, so to speak, enlisted or started at the academy weren't soldiers yet. I went there as a soldier, so I'd already completed my rifleman training. Actually, it wasn't that much of a challenge or that difficult because I was already familiar with that military mentality. Even so, I still suffered through it.
By the way, was there a moment during the course when you wavered a bit, thinking, I'm sure this is what I want? Because listening to the whole thing, even just the first 5 to 7 weeks, it's incredibly tough.
I don't think I ever got to the point of wanting to give up. I was very well prepared. So compared to the British students, the fact that I already had 2 years of military experience was a huge advantage. You have to understand that the competition to get into this academy is so fierce among the British that they're lining up with degrees from Cambridge and Oxford. Now, I think that physically I was in the middle of the pack, but mentally or intellectually I was absolutely at the bottom. So I'm not saying they were smarter at that level. Obviously, people are smarter in their own language. You're smarter in your own language. But intellectually, I was clinging to the bottom rung of the ladder.
Physically, the middle of the pack, well, I'm not sure if that's how it looks to the viewers at the table, but since you're a guy who's almost 2 meters tall, if I'm reading this correctly off camera, so then I still don't know much about.
In terms of endurance and in other respects, whether I'm looking at strength endurance, not aerobic endurance, or explosive power, so all things considered, taking all coordination and physical abilities into account, I was in the middle of the pack. By the way, before that, I was an athlete. I trained 12 times a week.
What sport did you do, by the way?
I did kayaking.
Well, that can give a person a good foundation.
Yes, I think I went there with a good foundation.
So at this academy, the Sturst Academy, it only really became known to the Hungarian public when it turned out that the Prime Minister's son, Gaspar Orbán, was studying there too. How often did you guys go there for a while?
If you look at it that way, the academy consists of 3 phases. That's 3 times 4 months. I was nearing the end of the first phase when I received a phone call. To be more precise, the head of the general staff at the time called me several times to say that an important political figure would be arriving for the phase following mine. He told me to feed him, give him drinks, take him to the bathroom, and make sure he completed the academy, because if he didn't, we'd lose our jobs. At first, I didn't know who he was talking about. Then just as I was starting the second phase, Gaspar suddenly showed up. He was still a major at the time, and sure enough, he was that person.
Who was the chief of staff who told you that?
I'd rather not name names.
When did this happen?
2019.
Obviously, anyone who wants to can probably piece it together from this. You had a personal connection with the Prime Minister's son back then, right? To what extent were you, I don't know, friends, colleagues, or classmates during that period?
We were absolutely good comrades under centers, by the way, since the 2 of us were among the Hungarians, so we stuck together and helped each other. There was a lot of pressure from the military leadership to pressure me into completing this academy, which I obviously didn't tell Gaspar.
How easy was it for him, by the way?
He struggled too, but he did graduate from the academy, so he wasn't given any special treatment just because he's the Prime Minister's son, which, by the way, I respect him for. Obviously, we talked a lot outside of training. He joined the military after serving in his home parish, which was interesting to me because after his basic training, we sent him straight to the academy, and the Hungarian Armed Forces, or the Ministry of Defense, sent him straight to the academy. So he didn't have to go through the official selection process just because he is the Prime Minister's son. It was a given that I would send him to the world's most expensive and best academy.
How much do you think this has undermined morale among young people who want to get into this program, given that it's an incredibly elite program? It costs 30 to 40 million forints per person. By the way, is it true that, as part of your total compensation, this was a stipend paid by the ministry in the case of Gaspar Orbán? Is it known that this was paid for?
I think the funding process was the same as it was for me. So the Ministry of Defense paid for it. This had a demoralizing effect on the soldiers. It was demoralizing. Obviously, because it is absolutely unjust. That is, because in the military we strive to be equal. We strive for a chain of command that is fair. We strive to uphold, so to speak, the chain of command. So the rank system and the fact that every rule applies to everything and everyone, I think that's the cornerstone of an army. You have to realize that based on his own abilities, not because he's the prime minister's son, he wouldn't have made it.
And did that, by the way, cause any moral dilemma for you? I mean, I assume he must have been aware of that.
Maybe he didn't know that back then, what was behind it all. I didn't know the army that well back then. So in reality, basic training is a form of initial military socialization, because it's actually far removed from the reality of what awaits a person later at their duty station. So his first interaction was actually with the British Army. That's where he met his first commanders, so to speak, and that's where he actually encountered his first military role models. But of course, one must realize that this was also a flawed socialization process, because in reality, the British Army is about 30 years ahead of us in terms of leadership and management, military technology, and military successes in general. An image formed in his mind based on British roots, which was actually very far removed from Hungarian reality, from Hungarian military reality.
But do you think that the fact he ended up there so quickly, or shortly after his training, was his own intention? So, did he think it was right that after just a few weeks of training, he would already be studying at the British Royal Academy? Or did this happen under some other influence?
I actually think that the military leadership at the time wanted to score points with the Prime Minister by doing this. I've actually thought a lot about this. If I were the Prime Minister and my son were to enlist in the army, would I actually accept that kind of flattery? Oh, thank you for sending my son. I'll do various good things for you in return, or I'll honor this in some way, but otherwise I wouldn't have accepted it as Prime Minister. No, my son enlisted in the army. The same rules apply to him as to everyone else. Private first class, private, done. There should be no special treatment because of me.
Did you work together later on, or did you have insight into his work?
Yes. I think we both gained a world-class British military perspective, a lens, so to speak, through which we could observe and assess the state of the Hungarian armed forces at the time. There were things we agreed on, and there were things we didn't. During the academy, I talked to him a lot about how, listen, what you're experiencing here at the academy, that doesn't exist within the Hungarian armed forces. So this isn't reality. We aren't that advanced. Our leaders aren't that well trained. We aren't at that level. He didn't believe me then. But later, when he went home, he believed it. The reality of the Hungarian armed forces hit him right in the face.
Just one more clarifying question. Regarding the fact that he completed this training, which, as you mentioned, is an incredibly rigorous physical and mental ordeal, was he given any special treatment there, simply because he is the son of a prime minister? Or was he just an ordinary soldier there, like everyone else?
Absolutely. He received no special treatment whatsoever. He was treated exactly like an ordinary soldier.
Did you complete the same training, the same program?
The same one.
And so, we were saying that you worked together. Or rather, what did you have in common? How can we know in what areas you worked together?
We started out on completely separate paths. I think we agreed on many things, namely that systemic changes were absolutely necessary in leadership, management, and mindset. Obviously, this definitely included military development, specifically military technology and infrastructure. But after the Sandhurst period, we began to go our separate ways. I was already preparing for the U.S. reconnaissance course. He, on the other hand, was suddenly transferred to the Carmelite unit and was given a first lieutenant's office. Or rather, he was assigned an office as a first lieutenant and began planning his African mission. This was interesting to me because after our return home, I had already received information that the Home Office had begun exploring the possibility of a potential African mission. And that's when I started connecting the dots, because at the British Academy, he talked a lot about how, during his volunteer Christian mission in Africa, he found God there. And in fact, God spoke to him from heaven, telling him to come and save these African people, to save the African Christians. And somehow this narrative, or this delusion in his head, just stuck with him. And I think that, in fact, this is what led him to start planning his own mission. Which, by the way, is an interesting thing because, let me tell you, no prior has ever been given his own office at the Carmelite monastery. Not a single first lieutenant, and since first lieutenant is nearly the lowest rank in the officer corps, the fact that he was involved in planning processes at the strategic level, based on his rank or position, would have been impossible had he not been the Prime Minister's son.
By the way, sorry, but there is some evidence to support this. For one thing, he was given an office at the Carmelite convent, and for another, he was the one who started planning the mission to Africa.
The proof of this is actually that, you see, during that period, we were still in touch, so to speak, regardless of his official duties. So I knew very well where he went to work and what he was doing, because he told me about these various strategic level, so to speak, military analyses, and the various problems he was facing in relation to actually getting this mission off the ground in Africa. So in fact, the fact that he had this delusion in his head, I wouldn't necessarily call it a delusion, but rather a personal interest that may, incidentally, be based entirely on religious grounds. For me, it was unacceptable that the Ministry of Defense and the military leadership would serve the will of the Prime Minister's son, no matter how absurd it might be. Because in reality, we have no national interest in this. Our national interest is not tied to this mission. Professionally, financially, and logistically, we are not ready to carry out an independent campaign in Africa. We simply aren't ready. Nations much stronger than ours have already run into trouble in Africa. We had a conversation where he shared the details of his plan with me, and he said that he expects a 50% combat casualty rate during the mission, which means that 50% of the Hungarian soldiers in the mission he leads will die. That's what it means.
You've referred to this several times here as an African mission, right? You mean the Chad mission, just so it's clear to the viewers. Did you try to convey your professional concerns regarding this in some way by referring to personal relationships, or perhaps in a different direction? I don't know, officially?
Absolutely, absolutely. Mainly personally, that is, during conversations between the two of us, I tried to convince him with reasoned arguments and a professional military stance not to push that. And I went to him because I actually knew that the only way to stop this whole process was to stop him. Because it's no use going to the Ministry of Defense, because if Gaspar Orbán wants it, it's going to happen one way or another.
I don't know how much of what was said had any effect.
It didn't.
But did you feel that the arguments might actually reach him, or that he might consider them, or that there was simply a very strong point, or that the motivation behind the whole thing was simply something else?
Yes. Let me give you an example. When I brought up this 50% loss in combat value, what you're talking about, I was actually trying to base it on what I learned at the Stork Academy, that in an operation like this, a mission like this, if I know that 50% of them will die, and there's no national interest at stake, then I won't risk the lives of Hungarian soldiers. You know what we learned in Sent? The response to that was that in order for us to be an army with advanced experience, we'll gain that experience through bloodshed.
How much do you think the ministry supported this idea? I mean, there are chat logs showing that Peter Szijjártó was on board, but Gaspar Orbán was also there in the capital. So how far along was this already? So I assume that if this calculation reached you, that they don't account for such large numbers of people with these kinds of measures, then I think, how should I put it, the relevant ministry was also aware of what is obviously a huge political risk beyond the human tragedies.
I absolutely believe that the reason this has been shelved now is that we're very close to the election, and the Prime Minister isn't going to take on a political risk like this anyway. It's possible that the next term will continue with this mission if they remain in government. We can't know that, but what's shocking to me is that the government's current message is that we won't send Hungarian soldiers to die in Ukraine, or, let's put it this way, to war. But when it comes to the Prime Minister's son's mission in Africa, we're sending Hungarian soldiers there to die.
And what was the perception of this whole Chad situation among the soldiers?
Those who work in leadership, in military leadership, know very well that this is actually Gaspar Orbán's personal initiative. At lower levels, the soldiers obviously aren't aware of this matter, and they don't know the reason behind it. From a professional standpoint, they can see that we have no business being there anyway. The soldiers know very well that neither our preparedness, nor our financial support, nor our logistics are ready for this. Actually, they have a big question. If, from a professional standpoint, we're not ready for this, then why are we pushing it so hard?
It's important to ask at this point. I think you can say that you were on good terms, good comrades. Whether anything happened between you afterward, even a rift of that nature, which is important to clarify from the viewer's perspective. So is there some unresolved issue between you, or is it just that you're now talking about this publicly, and this simply doesn't reflect your personal relationship?
I think our professional disagreement over our involvement in Africa ultimately put a definitive stamp on our comradeship or friendship. I've distanced myself from him.
And what do you think he'll think if, say, he sees you making these statements, whether about this mission or in connection with him?
I trust that you will view this positively, in the sense that you might change your mind and recall those officer values we acquired and learned at the British Military Academy. I trust that. I have to trust that.
When was the last time you had any personal interaction?
We spoke a few times after I submitted my discharge request.
Can you share any details about those conversations?
The content was actually quite interesting because in the year leading up to my discharge request, I had told him several times that I was going to leave the service. He also told me several times that he was going to leave. I actually submitted the discharge request in person, but at that point he didn't understand me at all. And I'm not saying that hurt, but it's why we had a negative view of the Hungarian armed forces system. He had his own reasons for wanting to leave. I had my reasons too. For him, the real turning point was that articles were written about it, and after that it sort of reached a political level where he has pretty strong roots, so to speak, in terms of which side he belongs to. And as my news, so to speak, began to weaken that side, he completely distanced himself from me and became absolutely hostile.
The military leadership, or even, well, obviously, the Minister of Defense himself, to what extent was he a wholehearted supporter of this Chad mission?
I think, by the way, that the leadership of the Ministry of Defense, and even the minister himself or the military leadership, the chiefs of staff, were not necessarily pleased that Gaspar Orbán is now a captain in the Hungarian armed forces for several reasons, because he was already moving in circles and at levels where he actually posed a threat to them and thus to their positions. Since who knows what Gaspar Orbán might say at its Sunday lunch at home, or from the perspective of his own plans, whom he might view as an obstacle, or whom he might tell his family is actually hindering his progress.
When you were still close, to what extent did you have insight into how Gaspar Orbán viewed the political direction and line represented by his father? How critical is he of it? Or to what extent does he actually think the same way as what is being implemented in Hungarian politics?
We didn't really have any conversations along those lines, actually. We didn't really touch on it. I didn't really want to bring it up either. When I raised issues regarding the Hungarian armed forces or the leadership, including the leadership of the Ministry of Defense, and when he did the same, both of us tried to set politics aside and view the Hungarian armed forces purely from a professional perspective as the country's defense force. But of course, he made statements regarding his views on the Chief of the General Staff and the Minister of Defense, both positive and negative. I don't know, however, to what extent his family connections, specifically the fact that his father was the Prime Minister, allowed him to leverage that. I didn't get that deep into the background to know what he was signaling at home, so to speak. And what was the Prime Minister's reaction to this, by the way?
A slightly lighter topic. Now, as we're nearing the end of the conversation, let's talk about military films and dragons over Kabul. We wrote in Telex that 2 pieces of military equipment went missing during filming, specifically during the production of the movie Drones Over Ball, and there were differing interpretations regarding just how serious these were and what happened afterward. What exactly went missing?
Actually, what went missing were 2 night vision goggles. These are devices that can be mounted on helmets to enhance visual capabilities. So as the name implies, they provide us with the ability to see in the dark at night. These are sensitive military devices. So I'd rather call them sensitive military technology devices. We store them strictly in a safe, in a secure location. Incidentally, their storage and handling during filming did not violate any regulations.
Incidentally, this statement is interesting because, you see, Lajos Tamas, who was the producer of the film, claimed that these were such insignificant devices that even a hunter could obtain them, and that not even a military investigation was launched regarding this matter. That was indeed the case. No investigation was launched at all.
There are 2 parts to this sentence or this statement. One is that, well, you can't buy something like this at a hunting store. So these are military technology companies that incidentally enter into agreements with the armed forces of certain nations under bilateral treaties. And that's how the procurement takes place. But we'd actually be in pretty big trouble if we bought night vision goggles at a hunting store and went into battle with them. You can't buy binocular white phosphorus flares that can be mounted on rifles at a hunting store anyway. The other issue is whether the Hungarian armed forces conducted an internal audit or not. I trust the Hungarian armed forces to be a sufficiently closed circle. How else would a civilian manufacturer know whether the Hungarian armed forces conducts internal audits or not? And if they do know, then our security protocols aren't functioning properly.
What is the value of these, by the way? Roughly.
I think it's hard to say, but between 5 and 10 million forints per unit.
Well, it's not exactly a headlamp I can use to peek into the tent to see if there's a woman there.
Yes.
It also came out later that a Ghidra combat vehicle was damaged during filming. Is there any information at all about the circumstances of this?
We're talking about a Ghidra assigned to the shoot. It didn't happen directly during a specific action scene or while filming was underway. Actually, it happened in the area next to the filming location during the preparation phase for the scene. But yes, so this Gidron was there for filming purposes, and yes, it was actually damaged and rendered combat ineffective. The Gidron couldn't leave on its own, so to speak.
You were involved in this shoot as a TOTI expert and also as an actor. But then afterward, if I understand correctly, they removed the fact that you were an expert from the credits. How did you experience that, by the way?
This whole Dragons over Kabul thing raises a lot of questions, by the way. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start from the beginning. So I was involved in it as a military expert, which is essentially a civilian contract with the producer and the production company. So I wasn't acting on a military order there, because a soldier cannot be ordered to participate in a film shoot. So that's incompatible with the rules of service, yes. And I also appeared in it as an actor. There's a very simple reason for that. The directors, by the way, thought I was a perfect fit. I didn't need a stunt double, I didn't need weapons training, I just had to learn a few lines and I was absolutely ready for an action film right away, and I actually improved the overall visual appeal. Actually, from this perspective, it was a win-win for both the producer and the director. It enriched the visual world, so to speak, or was otherwise a positive element of the film. And compared to the military series here in Dragons over Kabul, I actually landed one of the lead roles, which was a huge leap forward compared to my supporting role in the military series. But from a military expert's perspective regarding Dragons over Kabul, it's important to note that, compared to the military series, I believe the military support worked differently than it did for the film Dragons over Kabul. As was reported in the media, no cooperation agreement was actually reached between the Ministry of Defense and the production. Nor was a cooperation agreement reached between the Hungarian armed forces and the production. It's important to know that the extras appearing in the film were real soldiers, so they were assigned from a specific unit and appeared as extras in the film. In addition, heavy equipment was also deployed, which means various military vehicles, different land and air vehicles ranging from the largest to the smallest. We can mention the KC-390 transport aircraft, the H-225 helicopter, the H-185 helicopter, the Gidron combat vehicle, the Lynx combat vehicle, and the Leopard tank. So absolutely all of our new heavy equipment was present, which is an interesting thing because if a cooperation agreement isn't reached between the ministry and, say, the manufacturer, then from that point on, the Chief of Staff has nothing in his hands to legally justify ordering military personnel or military equipment to support this film, because as Chief of Staff, he cannot issue such an order to the soldiers. That's why the Ministry of Defense issued a statement saying that the soldiers participated in the film shoot voluntarily. I'd like to make this clear to everyone. So it wasn't the case that a captain woke up one morning, went into the barracks and decided, hey, I'm going to go shoot a movie now. I'll take the KC-390 transport plane. Goodbye. So that's not how it works. Every single piece of equipment was assigned, and indeed, at the bottom of the General Staff order, there is a signature indicating who assigned it.
So those weren't verbal orders. Rather, it's documented that this is how it happened.
Absolutely.
So you're assuming that if, say, someone requested this through a public records request or something, then they would either release it or not. But since this is still public information, who requested it, and for what purpose is relevant?
I think this is, and this is just my personal opinion, a very serious violation of service regulations. This is a serious violation of service regulations. I assume this and I assume it because, in fact, from this point on, there is no cooperation agreement. Yet as Chief of Staff, I deploy my military personnel, my staff, and deploy my military equipment to support something that is absolutely, and this concept, the arbitrary deployment of soldiers, because that is what actually happened.
And by the way, if I understand correctly, this happened within the normal scope of employment. So just as, say, in your case, there was a contract with the production company, but here the soldiers participating as extras did not receive any.
This is also a difficult question because I am deploying the soldiers. Now, from the perspective of the Chief of Staff, I am deploying my soldiers in Hungarian Armed Forces equipment, with their standard issue weapons and military technology to the filming location. Then, at the filming location, the soldiers sign a contract with producer Tamás Lajos for 10,000 Hungarian forints a day to appear in the film. So I deployed my soldiers, who, by the way, handle military equipment all day long. So in reality, their professional standards cannot be compromised because they are responsible for these tools and operate them. On the other hand, of course, they have a weapon, a real assault rifle, and yet they're signing a contract with a civilian producer, so who's really in charge from that point on? The boss, the producer on set, or the chief of staff who assigned me to this task? I'm performing a military task because I was assigned as a military task, but I'm getting paid for it. So now I'm a mercenary soldier. So a lot of questions come up regarding this issue.
And did that cause any issues on site? I don't know. Did things get tangled up because of that? Or was it because of this, or...
I don't think so, by the way, meaning the soldiers didn't receive any orders that actually caused them problems. In terms of communication, there was actually good cooperation between both civilians and soldiers.
And by the way, from an expert perspective, even though you didn't end up on the credits, how did you view the finished production in hindsight?
Actually, the core story was the rescue operation in Kabul. We called this the Shaman Shield operation within the Hungarian Defense Forces. So that's how we communicated it at the time. And it's true that this was Hungary's and the Hungarian Armed Forces' most successful rescue operation. But I still felt something was missing because we couldn't actually reveal the whole truth. I always say that the field personnel are the heroes, but there was also a heroic command staff. Who was the heroic commander in this story in reality? Rustin Sandy Romulus. He was the one who planned and executed this operation, but his name could not be mentioned because, by then, he was effectively considered an exiled, persecuted man. But actually, to be precise, when we mention heroic commanders, it's Rustin Sandy Romulus and Tamás Sándor. And we never addressed this anywhere. And for me, as a military officer, this was a huge misdirection. In fact, it was also painful that we couldn't tell the whole truth. And we put forward two commanders in my place, onto whom we pinned this, claiming they were the ones responsible for it, but they weren't.
Why were you replaced in this production?
Well, it wasn't actually stated explicitly, but it's because I submitted my resignation. And actually, since Tamás Lajos and Krzysztof Szalai Bobromki are good friends anyway, from that point on, I was completely cut out of the picture.
How were you notified of this, or how did it happen?
The production team simply stopped contacting me, even though a few weeks earlier, we had actually worked out what we were going to communicate, what I, as a military expert, was going to say. That's when the film's promotion actually started, and I didn't participate in the promotion at all. They didn't invite me to the premiere either. The fact that I wasn't invited to the premiere, by the way, hurt. That didn't sit well with me. Well, I spent a tremendous amount of time on this film to make it happen. From the script writing phase through the planning of the military logistics, all the way to the first and last days of filming. I didn't see this as a step forward on the part of the Minister of Defense, but, as I said, starting in 2023, there wasn't a responsible leader. There wasn't a responsible leader in this either.
As an actor, what do you think they said about this whole process? What happened to you that you were suddenly cut out of that content?
They were surprised by it, actually. Almost every actor called me, and, so to speak, expressed their sympathy, and they absolutely did not agree with how I was treated.
We started the conversation by asking what happened to you after the interview, or what kind of retaliation you could expect, and you said that it would depend on what comes out now, after more than an hour and a half, nearly 2 hours, so that you can see what the outcome of this conversation will be.
Disciplinary proceedings, that's for sure. As for what disciplinary offense I committed, I don't actually know exactly what they'll bring against me or what level of consequences there will be, but it's certain that I'll have to say goodbye to my profession. I think they'll terminate my employment.
You mentioned earlier in the interview that this is a profession and that you take a very solemn oath to defend the country and the homeland. Now that your employment relationship will end with your discharge, how are you processing this on a personal level? And how difficult is this situation for you right now?
I think that the current Minister of Defense has, over the past 4 years, essentially killed the military profession. In fact, in this form, it's not just me, but no other soldier is happy to serve. And that makes it a little easier for me to break away from this, which I actually love very much in my role.
If you manage to get discharged, do you have any plans for what you'll do in the future?
Just joking for now, but if there really is a national asset recovery agency, I'd be more than happy to join its tactical apprehension unit.
That's humor.
But there's some truth to it.
Sylvester Palinka, thank you very much for being here and agreeing to this interview.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Állj ki a Telexért adód 1%-ával. telex.hu/1%.